Welcome back to our lecture on cognitive linguistics. Today we will talk about embodiment. Now, classic information theory assumed that the mind worked like a computer. So perception would be the input, cognition would then deal with it, and then you would perform some kind of action. So the cognition bit is, as I said, like a computer, that there's just an abstract manipulation of symbols. But cognitive psychology showed that that's not true. Cognition is not modular, it's embodied in the mind. And today I will show you how embodiment affects language. Let's quickly read the following story. The polar bear's nose. Polar bears have a taste for seal meat and they like it fresh. So if you're a polar bear, you're going to have to figure out how to catch a seal. When hunting on land, the polar bear will often stalk its prey almost like a cat would, scooting along its belly to get right up close, and then pounce, claws first, jaws agape. The polar bear mostly blends in with its icy, snowy surroundings, so it's already at an advantage over the seal, which has relatively poor sense of vision. But seals are quick. Sailors who encountered polar bears in the 19th century reported seeing polar bears do something quite clever to increase their chances of a hot meal. According to these early reports, as the bear sneaks up on its prey, it sometimes covers its muzzle with its paw, which allows it go more or less undetected. Apparently, the polar bear hides its nose. Okay, so how did you picture this scene? I assume that you saw a polar bear who used its paw with white fur to cover its black nose. But this information is not mentioned in the text. If we go back to the passage, you will see that nowhere in the statement does it tell you anything about the nose being black, or that the polar bear has white fur. Here's the important part again. According to these early reports, as the bear sneaks up on its prey, it sometimes covers its muzzle with its paw, which allows it go more or less undetected. Apparently, the polar bear hides its nose. Nowhere does it say that the nose is black, but you just know this, and you also know that polar bears are white, right? So you inferred this meaning, you simulated the scene. You could sort of picture the polar bear approaching the seal, and because you know what polar bears look like, you knew that it was white except for the black nose. The example is from Bergen's excellent book, Louder Than Words, in which he explains how mental simulation works and how embodiment is a crucial part of our cognition. The example already shows that when we construe the meaning of a scene, we do not just rely on what's in the text. We rely on encyclopedic, that is real-world knowledge that we've encountered and learned over the years. And the simulations that we run are vivid and embodied because, like me, you probably simulated how the bear used its white paw to cover its black nose. So what cognitive science has shown us over these last couple of decades is that cognition is embodied. It's shaped by a body. So having a body is crucial for you to develop the kind of mental knowledge that you have. Related to that is that your cognition is embedded. It's dependent on extra bodily processes in the environment. So how your environment is structured, whether you drive cars or horse carriages or cycle to work, all of these things matter, how you interact with a context that surrounds you. Besides, our cognition is extended. There are extra bodily components. We have developed cultural tools that encode our knowledge. So we've got vast libraries, a huge number of books, and the World Wide Web now. And you can draw on that. That's externalized cognition, that's externalized knowledge that you can draw on. And being able to draw on this means we can take the next step. You don't have to remember everything, you can remember the important bits, and if you need to look something up, you can check it out in a book or on the World Wide Web. And finally, cognition is enactive. It is used in the active engagement in and with the environment. So your cognition isn't shaped by your body and by interacting with the world once for all. It's constantly being updated, and it is this constant active engagement with the environment that shapes your cognition throughout your life. As Lakoff says, the structures used to put together our conceptual systems grow out of bodily experience and make sense in terms of it. Moreover, the core of our conceptual system is directly grounded in perception, body movement, and experience of a physical and social nature. If you think back to last session when we talked about generative grammar, you can see how different cognitive linguistics views cognition and language from the generativists. They assume that language is a module that is more or less independent of domain general cognition. In stark contrast to this, cognitive linguists believe that cognition is embodied and that language crucially draws on body movement, perception, and our experience of physical and social nature. Now, there are two aspects to this. There is a developmental part and an online part. Let's start with a developmental point of view. Let's look at what Lakoff and Johnson have to say on this. The claim that the mind is embodied is therefore far more than a simple-minded claim that the body is needed if we are to think. Our claim is, rather, that the very properties of concepts are created as a result of the way the brain and body are structured and the way they function in interpersonal relations and in the physical world. So, under this developmental view, cognitive behaviors, including language, are built from perceptual, motor and affective experiences. It is these perceptual, motor and affective experiences that create concepts. So that's how concepts end up in your mind. In addition to that, you could assume that, well, once the concepts are there, the perception and the motor activity no longer plays a role. But there is, and there is good evidence for this, also an online view to embodiment. And that assumes that all these bodily experiences remain important for your cognition all through your life, whenever you think, whenever you use it. Again, let's look at Lakoff and Johnson, 1999. In an embodied mind, it is conceivable that the same neural system engaged in perception, or in bodily movement, plays a central role in conception. That is, the very mechanisms responsible for perception, movements, and object manipulation could be responsible for conceptualization and reasoning. So that's the online view. Your cognitive behaviors, including language, remain linked to perceptual, motor, and affective experiences. And whenever you use language, these perceptual and motor experiences are also activated. Let's look at the empirical evidence for the developmental as well as the online view of embodiment. Let's start with a developmental view. There are so-called image schemas. These are recurring bodily experiences that lead to schematic mental representations of meaning. Mark Johnson and George Lakoff came up with the idea of an image schema. Let's take, for example, containment. We very often assume that our human body is a container, and also we are used to being located in containers. So you physically are in a room right now, perhaps, or you can be in bed, or you can be in cars, any kind of vehicles, in trains and so on. You are used to being inside of a container, and you know that things can be put into containers like boxes. Now, several things follow from that. From our bodily experience of containers, we, for example, know that they can be inside of the container or outside of the container. That when they're inside of the container, they are protected from outside forces and at the same time can only move to a certain degree. Now, these embodied experiences that lead to image schemas can then be used to describe non-physical phenomena. So we can draw on our bodily experience with containers in order to talk about feelings, emotions, and other non-physical concepts. Take the examples in 1 through 4. The ship is out of sight. Now, your sight is not technically a real container, right? You haven't got a box around your head that limits what you can see, no blinkers. But at the same time, we think of our view as being a container, because things can be inside of it, or if I can't see them, then they're outside of the container. So that's why you can say the ship is in sight, if it's inside of this metaphorical container, or out of sight, if you no longer see it. In 2, trouble is construed as a container. So if you're in trouble, you can't really move out of it. You're sort of smack bang in the middle of that container until you're out of trouble. Also 3, you're stuck in a boring job. Again, you're stuck in this box, in this container of a job. Finally, we mentioned this in one of the earlier sessions, you can be in or out of love. Love is a highly complicated phenomenon and it's a highly complicated concept, but in order to talk about it the way that we feel about it, we draw on the image schema of containment. Love becomes a container and either you're in or you're out. Now, image schemas, and in particular spatial metaphors, are very important for talking about abstract concepts and feelings. As Lakoff and Johnson point out, happy, for example, in many languages is up, sad is down. So I'm feeling up, my spirits rose, you're in high spirits, are all positive, that's up. I'm feeling down, I'm depressed, he's really low these days, my spirits sank. And you can see how the image schema here is again embodied. Because if you think about it, when you're feeling well, when you're feeling happy, you straighten up, you smile, you laugh, your eyes open a bit more, your lips go up for the smile. And at the same time, if you're depressed, if you're unhappy, your lips go down, your eyes are a bit droopy and the eyelids are closed. Also, your body posture is going to sink a bit. So you can see how the bodily experience of being in a positive emotional state is more up and being sort of depressed and negative is more down. Similarly, consciousness is up and consciousness is down. So you wake up, whereas you fall asleep. He dropped off to sleep, he's under hypnosis, he sank into a coma. And again, you can see how the bodily experience plays a huge role here because, well, when you sleep, you normally lie down, you're on the ground, whereas if you wake up, you get up as a bipedal human, you walk around. So again, up is conscious, down is unconscious. And in a similar vein, health and life, positive things are up, sickness and death are down. He's at the peak of health, he's in top shape, he fell ill, he's sinking fast, he came down with the flu, his health is declining. Okay, and you can also see how these are related. So happy being up and sad being down, those are obviously also going to be related to health and life, sickness and death correspondingly. So again, when we talk about all of these abstract concepts, emotional states, state of consciousness, health and so on, we draw on embodied image schemas. And in the session on metaphors, we will explore this in even more depth. Now, what are the features of image schemas? Well, image schemas arise because of many similar bodily experiences, and because of pattern detection, we generalize over these. That means they're schematic. So being in a container is not linked to your experience to being in a specific room, but it's generalized across you being in a room, you're being in a car, and in different buildings and so on. And then concepts can interface across the cognitive systems and they can be combined. More about that in the session on metaphors. However, because they are embodied, they still preserve structural and perceptual motor aspects of the specific experiences they schematize over. So containment, being inside of something, being limited in movement, all these image schemas are grounded in experience. Okay, so far we've seen that there is linguistic evidence of what we can see in the language that seems to support the view that your cognitive concepts develop, arise through interaction with the environment, that they are embodied. That's the developmental point of view. But there is also evidence for the processing point of view, which means that motor activity in your mind as well as perceptual, sensory information also play a role. Glenberg and Kashek did a classic study on this, in which they studied the action sequence compatibility effect. Look at 8 and 9. In open the, one's the command open the drawer, the other one is close the drawer. Okay, think about it. If you open a drawer, you take your hand, you touch the drawer and you pull it towards you. Whereas if you close it, you shove the drawer away from you. Okay? Opening is towards you, closing is away from you. That's motor action. Now in this study, what Glenberg and Kashek did, they obviously did an experimental study so that people would see these sentences and then would have to press a button and say whether that's a sensical or a nonsensical sentence. So in the experiment, they also got sentences like boil the air. Now that's not a sensical sentence, so they would have to press no. Open the drawer, perfectly acceptable sentence, they would have to press yes. Now what Glenberg and Kashek did is they manipulated the response buttons. So for some of the experiment, the subjects had a response button that looked like this, where the yes button was closer to them and the no button was further away. For another part of the experiment, the yes button was further away from them, whereas the no button was closer to them. And think about it, opening something means towards you, closing means away from you. And now this is actually what they found, that there's an interaction between the motor action as well as the sentence, even though these people didn't have to open or close any drawers. So if they had opened the drawer, they were faster to respond if the yes button was towards them, and slower if the yes button was away from them. Conversely, if they had closed the drawer, they were quicker to respond that this is a grammatical, sensical sentence if the yes button was away from them, in contrast to when it was closer to them. So what must have happened is the fact that they must have stimulated the action for this to play a role. Because an open the drawer towards you is already activated, you're quicker to press something that is towards you. Because close the drawer is away from you, you're quicker to press the button that's away from you. So it's as if your motor action is already primed, is already part of the simulation when you hear the sentence. And as you can see from their examples, despite the fact that the graph looks really complicated, this is an effect they found in imperatives, but also in concrete declarative transfer sentences. So you gave the book to Mary, Mary gave the book to you. In one case, if you give a book to someone, it goes away from you. If someone gives a book to you, it's towards you. And the same can be used for abstract ideas, things that you can't really touch and manipulate in space. You can also tell someone a story and then you give them the story. Or someone tells you a story and the story comes to you, metaphorically speaking. Okay, as I said, the graph looks complicated, but let's just look at the white elements. These are the cases of towards. Okay, if something, either in the imperative, open the drawer, or someone tells you a story, or someone gives you something. In all these cases, it's towards you. And these are the white lines. And in all of these, for the white towards you condition, if the yes button was closer, people were faster, so their response times are lower. Whenever the button was further away from them, which seems to contradict the stimulated action, their response times were longer. So if yes is far, the button is further away, response times for all of these elements increased. In contrast to this, for the away actions, close the drawer, you tell someone a story, you give someone something, you see the opposite effect. Okay? Because it goes away, if the yes button is closer, it took people longer to respond. So you see this for the imperatives, you see this for concrete transfer, and you see it for abstract transfer. But if the button was further away from them, which is in line with a simulated physical action, they were faster to respond. So yes is far is always lower for the away action than the yes is near button. So this is already good evidence that when you process a sentence, and there weren't any real drawers there wasn't any real concrete thing that you transfer to someone. You only had to think about the sentences. And it seems to be that you already activated, you primed the action. Now this is a really cool study, and as we will see, several similar psychological studies have supported this finding. Zwandal, for example, asked people to rate whether two objects were the same. They saw a blank screen, then they saw an object, like for example a softball, then they saw a blank screen, and then they saw the object again, but maybe in different size. Now of course, if you look at this, it's the same thing, so you will click yes. But they now manipulated the condition. You heard the sentence, the pitcher hurled the softball to you, or you hurled the softball to the pitcher. Now if you think about it, that construes two different scenes. In 10, the pitcher throws the softball towards you, so as you see it, it becomes bigger and bigger. Whereas if you throw a softball away, then it starts out pretty big, but the further it travels away from you, the smaller it gets. Now, they manipulated the experiment in a way that people sometimes saw a small ball first, followed by a bigger one, or a bigger one followed by a smaller. So there weren't any real softballs there, but you can see how smaller to bigger sort of gives you the image as if the softball is coming towards you, whereas bigger to smaller makes it appear as if it's traveling away from you. Now, as you can already guess, what they found was that hearing the sentences made a difference. So whether you heard a sentence where you had to think about the ball coming towards you or away from you, changed the speed with which people responded. So if you had the smaller ball first, followed by a bigger version of this, you were faster to respond to this and say that it's the same object if you had the pitcher hurled the softball towards you, where you picture it coming towards you, it becoming bigger. In contrast to this, the other way round, if it's big and becomes smaller, that was slower for 10. For 11, you hurled the softball towards the pitcher, where you simulate the ball moving away from you and getting smaller. You were faster to respond for the picture sequence bigger to smaller, which exactly fits this kind of visual representation, in contrast to the other one. So in both cases, you would have assumed that it's the same ball just in different sizes and that the order shouldn't matter. But it turns out that when you hear a sentence, you visually simulate. So you use your visual cortex to simulate the scene, and that means you're quicker to respond if what you see corresponds to what you simulate. Now, another study was carried out by Yaxley and Swan. They showed people an object and asked them, did you hear them in the preceding sentence? Now, in their experiment, subjects would be exposed to sentences like, through the clean goggles, the skier could easily identify the moose, or through the fogged goggles, the skier could hardly identify the moose. And then they would see a picture of an object. Now, interestingly, if you had a high-resolution picture, it turned out that 12, which says that you see the moose clearly, was correctly identified faster than for 13, where you talked about fogged goggles. And if people were shown a low-resolution picture that almost looks as if you're looking at a moose through fog, you got the opposite effect. So people were faster to respond to this object if they had heard the sentence that they'd seen the moose through the fogged goggles. So in their minds, what subjects did, they construed a very vivid, simulated scene. So after hearing either 12 or 13, subjects simulated completely different scenes because they were either primed to picture the moose clearly or less clearly. So again, already before their decision, the mental simulation played a role and the visual perceptual system must have been active. Now, so far we've looked at psycholinguistic evidence for the online view, but there is also neurological evidence. So where in the mind things are processed. A classical study is Newberg, 2001, who used positron emission tomography, a PET study, which basically tells you which parts of the brain light up while processing something. Now, in this study, subjects heard sentences like make a fist. Now, there was an enactment encoding condition in which the subjects had to perform the command. So the PET study is going to tell you which parts of the brain light up if you're actually making a fist, which motor and sensory information is lit up. And then in the verbal retrieval condition, they got the sequence make a, and they had to remember which noun they heard in this sequence. So they would have to say make a fist, but this time without performing the command. Now on the left, what you see is the activation in the brain when you perform the action. And you see some parts, especially at the top and to the front of the brain, that involve motor areas, but towards the back you also see sensory and perceptual information that's activated. To the right, what you see is the verbal retrieval condition. So in this condition, people didn't make a fist. And of course, that's why some of the areas are not lit up as much. But at the same time, to the front of the brain, where the motor areas are, you see activation, and also to the sensory information at the back. So people partly activated the parts of the brain that are associated with a motor action, with the actual action of making a fist, despite the fact that they didn't make a fist. So If you think back to the psycholinguistic studies, we have seen that people were faster in their responses if the language fit the action that they were supposed to do or rate. But that is just performance data. It doesn't tell you what's actually going on in the brain. Studies like these, however, the PET study by Newberg as well as others, show you that the parts of the brain that we postulated must be activated on top of purely linguistic areas are also activated when we simulate language, when we don't carry out a command, but we think about it. And there is further neurological evidence along these lines. So if you grasp a concept, which is again a metaphorical use, right? You can't actually physically grasp a concept because an idea is not something that is an actual physical thing. But it was shown that similar motor areas are activated as in grasp a straw, where you simulate actually holding a straw. If you use a taste metaphor, she looked at him sweetly, then you can show increased activation of gustatory perception areas, which don't light up if you say things like she looked at him kindly. So the metaphor sweetly still activates perception areas. And in Sam had a rough day, in contrast to Sam had a bad day, rough is again, of course, something that is embodied, something that you can feel and you know involves your tactile areas. And similarly to the examples before, you can show that there's increased activation in the tactile areas if you say a metaphorical sentence like Sam had a rough day. So summing up, language is not an independent, self-sufficient module in the mind. Instead, cognition, and that includes language, is embodied, embedded, extended, and enacted. The crucial point here is through interacting with the world, through having a body, through doing things, and for language that also means multimodal communication, looking at facial expressions, looking at what the hands do, but also manipulating objects in the real world and talking about it, are all linked very closely together. There are still open questions in embodiment research. For example, to what degree abstract concepts such as time are embodied. So we've seen that there is an instance that areas are activated, but how much, to what degree? And also, what are the limits of online embodiment? Does there come a time when you've talked about things so often that you don't need to rely on the bodily experience anymore? Can something become sort of divorced from activation in motor and perceptual areas? So that was our session on embodiment. Next session we will focus on other very important domain general cognitive properties as we will move on to perception, attention, and viewpoint. In the PowerPoint slides, which I make available via academia, you will find selected references for further reading, as well as the references to the studies, the explicit studies that I mentioned today on embodiment. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to seeing you again next time.